Hello everyone, my name is Nazo. I'm an Orthodox composer, and today I would like to talk about the Cherubic Hymn. The Cherubic Hymn is the point in the Divine Liturgy that symbolizes the shift from the liturgy of the catechumens to the liturgy of the faithful. And it happens pretty dramatically, and we'll get into that fairly quickly actually. The best way to understand the purpose of the Cherubic Hymn is to read the text. I'd like to do that, but I also would like to read the text for a few other cherubic hymns that are sung at different points during the church year. We have something different sung for Holy Thursday. We sing Of Thy Mystic Supper. We have a different cherubic hymn that is sung for the Liturgy of the Pre-Sanctified Gifts, and for Holy Saturday, we have the very famous Let All Mortal Flesh. But by reading all of these cherubic hymns, we will understand the purpose of this hymn. So, to begin, the cherubic hymn typically says, "We who mystically represent the cherubim and sing the thrice holy hymn to the life-giving Trinity, let us lay aside all earthly cares, that we may receive the King of all, who comes invisibly escorted by the angelic hosts." First off, the purpose of this hymn is to prepare us for communion. That is clearly stated, that we may receive the King of all. Now, interestingly enough, escorted by angelic hosts may be a reference to the second coming of Christ. The phrase Lord of Hosts gives us a little bit of a historical context. There's speculation that this hymn may have been sung as a type of refrain to the verses of Psalm 24, where that phrase, again, Lord of Hosts, appears. Now, this hymn is all about the preparation of communion. When we shift to the liturgy of the faithful, everything becomes about communion at that point. We can see this in some of the other texts of the cherubic hymn. For example, for the Liturgy of Pre-Sanctified Gifts, "Now the powers of heaven with us invisibly do serve. Lo, the King of glory enters. Lo, the mystical sacrifice is upborne, fulfilled. Let us draw nigh with faith and love, and become communicants of life eternal." And then, Alleluia, Alleluia. And the cherubic hymn also ends with the three Alleluias as well. All of them end with three Alleluias. If we look at Let All Mortal Flesh, the text says, "Let all mortal flesh keep silence and stand with fear and trembling, and take no thought for any earthly thing. For the King of kings and Lord of lords comes to be slain and given as food for the faithful. Before him go the choirs of angels with every principality and power, the many-eyed cherubim and the six-winged seraphim covering their faces and crying out the hymn, Alleluia." For Holy Thursday, we sing, "Of thy mystical supper, O Son of God, accept me today as a communicant, for I will not speak of thy mystery to thy enemies. Neither like Judas will I give thee a kiss, but like the thief will I confess thee. Remember me, O Lord, in thy kingdom. Alleluia." So the cherubic is typically sung on Sundays, and those hymns that I just read replace the cherubic hymn on their specific feast day, during Holy Week or during the Liturgy of Pre-Sanctified Gifts. But they all have a very strong tell that this is about communion. Now, we know that this hymn was established in our church around the 6th century. It was sung quite differently than what you may imagine. If you hear your standard cherubic hymn in the Orthodox Church, what you'll hear is something that is typically drawn out very long. This is to serve the liturgical function, meaning the function is to bring the holy gifts into the altar. Historically, this was brought over from a separate building into the altar. Traditionally, right now, we take it from the prothesis table, go around the church to symbolize the travel into the altar, and then bring it to the altar. The interesting thing is, this hymn doesn't necessarily have to be a long, slow, drawn-out hymn. In fact, we have evidence to the contrary. We have evidence that it was typically sung 3 times by chanters, and then repeated 3 times by the people. And then the chanters would sing verses from Psalm 24. Now, this is an assumption by many scholars. We don't know for sure, but again, that line, Lord of Hosts, tells us it was probably Psalm 24. And with each verse, the people would respond with Alleluia. But they would also respond appropriately depending on which cherubic hymn was being sung. For example, if it was Holy Thursday and they were singing Of Thy Mystic Supper, then the refrain to the psalm verses that the chanters would sing, the refrain would be, "Remember us, O Lord, in thy kingdom." So the the refrain would change depending on which of those cherubic hymns would be sung. And then it would end with the chanters singing one more time the entire cherubic hymn, and then one more time the people singing the whole thing. This is quite interesting because it means that there are lots of repetitions. In fact, there's been some speculation that we don't necessarily sing Alleluia 3 times. At least we shouldn't, according to the rubrics, that the number 3 that appeared next to the Alleluia actually denoted that the whole hymn was to be sung 3 times, not just the Alleluia. Again, this is a point of a mild contention among some of the scholarship in the Orthodox Church. But we also have some criticisms that have been levied about the use of the cherubic hymn. First off, there have been some concerns that the people are singing the hymn as if the gifts are already sanctified, when at the moment they are still the bread and the wine that are being carried into the altar. And then later, during the Holy Anaphora, that is when the Holy Spirit comes down and it is mystically transformed into the body and blood of Christ. But some scholars and some church leaders were a bit disheartened by the extreme solemnity that the people would sing as if it was already the body and blood of Christ, which is an interesting criticism to levy against this hymn. The second aspect, and this one is, I think, far more interesting, is that the petitions of the priest were typically, at that point, done quietly. If you attend an Orthodox service, you'll see the choir sing most of the cherubic hymn, and they'll typically go up to, "Let us now lay aside all earthly cares." In the Greek tradition, I think in the Greek Archdiocese, you actually sing until "that we may receive the King of all," and then you stop. But typically, most traditions I've seen stop at, "Now let us lay aside all earthly cares." And then the priest has 1 or 2 petitions. And then the choir sings the rest of the hymn, "that we may receive the King of all, escorted by the angelic hosts, Alleluia." Now, typically, the priest would do these petitions quietly because the cherubic hymn was not supposed to be interrupted. This was one of the criticisms that was levied against the practice of the cherubic hymn, is when the priests started doing their declarations more loudly. And in the Russian tradition, they actually, at some points, even added some more petitions to be said. So, again, this is not at all indicating that we need to be changing things to go back to the old practice. This is how things naturally change within the tradition of our church. What I like to do when I'm directing the choir, there's this one specific cherubic hymn that we do where we're able to hold an eson during the priest's petitions, and the priest intones it in the same mode that we were singing in to give the feeling of it being uninterrupted. So that's a little solution that I've found, but at the same time, it's not the biggest deal. That's just kind of the new tradition that has happened with the cherubic hymn. It's morphed into something that is a lot more melismatic. That means it has very long phrases with a lot of notes on just a small number of syllables. So it takes a long time to sing through. And that is the purpose of the cherubic hymn. It does need to take time to give the priest time to do all of his prayers, which include the 50th Psalm, which include, several prayers, which include all of these liturgical actions that need to take place, in addition to getting the entire altar with all of the altar boys and the deacons lined up and ready to process, as well as preparing the gifts and having them ready to go. So it does need to take time. It's just interesting that historically that was done by repetition, by antiphonal singing, which is reminiscent of the first, second, and third antiphons that are sung at the beginning of liturgy. I find it fascinating that in almost all of them, with the exception of Thy Mystical Supper, which is sung on Holy Thursday, all of these cherubic hymns are about the angelic powers joining us now in preparation for communion, which is the purpose of liturgy. It brings a type of seriousness and a type of austerity to the act of communion that is hard to ignore once you see it, once you understand that we are joining with the angels and that we are both a representation of them mystically right now through the act of this hymn and through the procession. And it is with that type of austerity that we go and we dare to receive the body and blood of Christ. So I hope this was useful. Thank you for watching. As always, thank you very much to my patrons for their continued support. Thank you all for your feedback, especially to all the people at church that like to give me feedback in person. Thank you very much.